And alright, let's get into it now. We just finished going over all of the accessory structures of the eye, how the eye pertains to the human, what kind of color range we see, where tears come from, what their function is, and all these other structures that help your eye function appropriately. Now we're going to actually get directly into the eye itself. So here we go. Believe it or not, your eye is a pressurized hollow organ. As small as it is extremely complex. So the eye as a whole is surrounded by this fat pad. What it does is it provides insulation, support, and padding for the eye. There are essentially two cavities in the eye also. You have, remember keeping cavities are like an empty cavernous space, but you have a posterior cavity and you have the anterior cavity. The posterior cavity, posterior referring to the backside, it has what's called vitreous body in there. It's also called vitreous humor, so do not forget that. Vitreous body and vitreous humor are synonymous, but it's a gelatinous material. When we did the cow eye dissection, this gelatinous material was very minimal, but its main purpose is that gelatinous material, that vitreous body or vitreous humor that fills the posterior cavity, is what allows your eye to maintain its nice rounded shape. You also have the anterior cavity. The anterior cavity is in the front of the eye. The anterior cavity is filled, I don't know why this says filler, but it's filled with what's called aqueous humor. Aqueous humor is more of a liquidy substance, not necessarily gelatinous, and what it also does is it aids in maintaining the shape of the eye. Typically, the border between the anterior cavity and the posterior cavity is going to be the iris. So that anterior cavity then can be divided into two chambers. So your posterior cavity is just one big space. Then you have the anterior cavity, which is a bit smaller, and we can take that anterior cavity and divide it into two different chambers. So you have the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. So let's go ahead and label these. So your anterior cavity here of this eyeball is going to run typically from right here, from the edge of the cornea, all the way down here to the iris and the lens. And what you're going to get then is from the iris and the lens right down in here, you have the posterior chamber. And then from the iris to the cornea, you have the anterior chamber. Keep in mind, both of these two things filled with aqueous humor. Everybody say aqueous. I heard you say it at home. Okay. The anterior chamber. Then you have the posterior chamber. So the anterior chamber is going to have this section above the iris of the cornea. Posterior chamber. It's going to contain the lens, suspensory ligaments, ciliary muscles. Okay. The posterior cavity is going to be everything back here. So you're going to have the posterior cavity, anterior cavity, and that anterior cavity is going to be divided into two sections called the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. Here this is filled with aqueous humor. Look at that cursive with a mouse. And this is going to be filled with vitreous humor. Oh my gosh, perfect cursive. Gosh. Oh man, I accidentally exited out of the PowerPoint. Let's go back in there. Alright, so you can take the eyeball now as a whole that is surrounded by fat and actually has two cavities, and the anterior cavity is divided into two chambers, and you can divide it into layers. Another word for layer is tunic. So I'm going to try to use those two synonymously, but most people in the profession, they call it the tunics of the eye. So one of the first tunics is going to be called the fibrous tunic. This is the outermost layer of your eye. The structures that are included in the fibrous tunic are going to be the sclera. Rewinding back a little bit, the sclera is all the white portion of your eye. It is white because it is made of a dense connective tissue. The other reason it's white is because it is not very vascular, meaning it doesn't have a rich blood flow to it. Of course, yes, you can see like the bloodshot look of eyes from time to time, but believe it or not, the sclera is mostly avascular. It is also the point, the sclera You can't just think of it as the front portion of the white of your eye. If you lift both of your eyelids up so you can see around the top rounded part and the bottom rounded part, you will notice that it's continually white. So the sclera actually continues completely around to the back side of the eye. And that is where all of the extrinsic eye muscles attach. The superior rectus, the inferior rectus, the medial rectus, all of the eye muscles attach into, or the extrinsic eye muscles that control your eye movement attach to the sclera. You also have, as part of the fibrous tunic, is the cornea. One thing you have to understand about the sclera and the cornea is they're actually continuous structures. Even though the cornea is the transparent portion of it, it is continuous, meaning it connects in a fluid-ish motion with the actual sclera itself. The only difference is the cornea is transparent. It's essential for it to be transparent. If it wasn't transparent, you would not be able to see. Light would not pass through it. So this is actually the first point of contact in which light enters the eye is going to be the cornea. This is also one of the points where your vision can actually start to be distorted. This is the cornea can be where astigmatisms form, which is a misshapen cornea that allows light to pass through in a funky way, which doesn't focus perfectly on the retina. It allows light to pass through. That's why it's transparent. There are no blood vessels, and it does not repair itself after damage. You can, in fact, get serious eye injury from scratching your cornea. And believe it or not, there's even such a thing as corneal transplants, where you can get donor corneas and have them transplanted onto your own eyes. So, but another question is, if it doesn't have a blood supply and it can't repair itself, where does it obtain the essential nutrients, because it is living tissue? And the answer is tears. Tears are what are going to supply your corneas with the essential nutrients. Contacts. The thing about contacts are they are placed directly over your corneas. The contacts are made to adjust light entering the cornea, which focuses the light perfectly on the back of the retina. Early contacts made of hard material. One of the big downsides to them is they prevented tears from flowing onto the eyes and the cornea, and it resulted in lots of eye infections, and it resulted in eye irritation. When we started getting into the disposables, the breathable contacts, your eyes actually need exposure to those tears and the oxygen in the environment, things like that, in order to maintain proper function. Believe it or not, early contacts were made of glass, like really early contacts, and that would have been brutal. Can you imagine the irritation from that? So let's get into some of the structures of the fibrous tunic. So you have the sclera. Let's kind of outline the sclera here real quick. You need to understand the sclera is all of this white material around the outside of the eye. It's not just the white that you see when you look in somebody's eyes. You also have the cornea. Here's what I want you to pay attention to here. The cornea is going to be that transparent portion that bubbles out on your eyes. I had this babysitter once when I was little. He had the bubbliest corneas. His eyes almost look like cat eyes. But something I need you to understand here again, that I pointed out earlier, is it is continuous with the sclera. So the sclera runs itself directly into the cornea. Dang it, I did it again. Just as a quick review, you have this entire area right here. Hoo-yah! Anterior cavity filled with aqueous humor. That aqueous humor keeps the pressure, maintaining the corneal shape. And then you have the conjunctiva. Again, just kind of rewinding. The conjunctiva is continuous, or connects to the sclera. And then if we were to draw eyelids on here, you would see that the conjunctiva would do this, and it would make this swoop back like this, forming the eyelid with some eyelashes. Man, that's really good looking. And then you'd have it do this over here with some more eyelashes. Oh yeah, looking good, looking good. And that, my friends, was the fibrous tunic. Now we're going to get into the second layer, or you could call it the medial layer of the eye. This is called the vascular tunic. I bet you can't guess what's in it. Vessels, hence the name vascular tunic. This is where your blood vessels, your lymphatic vessels associated with your immune system, and the intrinsic eye muscles attach. Intrinsic are inside the eye, extrinsic are the ones that attach outside the eye. So the intrinsic eye muscles control like the lens shape and the size of the pupil, things like that. Things that are important here about the vascular tunic: it is essential for nutrient flow, and it actually helps regulate the nutrients to the eye itself. It also has a main job of regulating the amount of light that enters the eye. This is that photopupillary reflex that we were talking about, that we did in our lab, where you close your eyes really tight and put your hands over there, and then you open your eyes and you shine the light in there, and that light, that drastic change in light caused the iris to change shape, which regulated the amount of light entering the eye. You also have the fact that it regulates and produces aqueous humor, so it helps maintain the pressure in the anterior cavity of the eye, and it also controls the shape of the lens through suspensory ligaments, which we'll get into in a little bit, and and the muscles. So let's get into the structures of the vascular tunic. You have the iris. The iris is the colored portion of your eye. It is essentially two sets of muscles, but it contains its own blood vessels. It contains cells called melanocytes. Melanocytes are actually the cells that produce eye color. And they also contain the opening. The iris also contains an opening in the middle of it that it can change shape based on the contraction and relaxation of those muscles that are within it. And that hole in the iris is called the pupil. The iris itself connects to what is called the choroid, and this was easily torn when we were doing the eye dissection. A lot of the groups that came around to remove the iris from the choroid. The pupil, again, it's the hole in the iris itself, and the pupil is surrounded by two groups of smooth muscle. One forms rings, called it's the sphincter muscle, and the other are called radiate outwards, which are called radial muscles. In the iris, you have different colors of eyes. Believe it or not, genetically speaking, in human genetics, we recognize upwards of 16 different colors of eyes. So the color of your eyes is actually determined by the number of melanocytes. Melanocytes are the color pigment producing cells that are on the epithelium on the backside of the iris. So the darker your eye color, the more melanocytes that iris contains. So let's look at the iris again. Remember when we were talking about it's basically composed of two sets of muscles. You have ring-shaped muscles right here, which are called the sphincter muscles. And then you have the radial muscles, which radiate out like sun rays. Radiate, radial, get that? That extend out. The big thing that they do is when one of them contracts, it shrinks the size of the pupil to let less light in. And when the other contracts, it increases the size of the pupil. So if you think about this logically, when muscles contract, they get shorter. That means they will pull. Let's take the radial muscles here as a whole. So if these radial muscles here contract and get shorter, they are going to pull the eye towards the outside here. When that occurs, the pupil will get larger. But in order for this to actually occur, the sphincter muscles themselves of the iris have to remain relaxed. So in a low light situation, you would expect the radial muscles to be contracting to open the size of the pupil and the sphincter muscles to be relaxed. The opposite occurs in situations where there's intense light. The radial muscles would be relaxed and the sphincter muscles would contract to shrink the size of the pupil. Here is a picture of somebody who had their pupils dilated. So essentially it's like causing the radial muscles to lose their ability to contract, or you could look at it as causing the causing the sphincter muscles to lose their ability to contract, or it's causing the radial muscles to be contracted over long periods of time. Doctors do this to increase the size of the pupil so they can see into your eyes a lot easier. And this would be the opposite effect. So you would have a high light situation in which you want the pupil to be a lot smaller. I do love the fact that there are 16 different eye colors, so it'd be crazy if on your driver's license they had you put all these different eye colors, like so they had blue, lighter blue, blue with a little bit of brown on the inside, then you got this grayish color. It's just nuts. But the scale ranges from a light blue to a dark brown or black color. This is just getting into what I was talking about earlier, and the fact that the iris is a muscular structure in which contracts and relaxes in different sets. So when the radial muscles contract, you get a dilated pupil. When the sphincter muscles contract, you get a constricted pupil. And this is just showing you how it allows more light to come in to be focused on the retina. In a low light situation, bigger pupil, more light, smaller pupil, less light. Okay, the next structure we're getting into in the vascular tunic is the lens. The lens is literally just like a magnifying glass lens, or like the lenses of your glasses. Its main job is to focus light and images onto the retina so they can generate action potentials which get sent to the brain so you can interpret those action potentials and actually be able to see. The lens itself has to be able to change the focal point of light based on structures that are close to you or far away, and that is done by ciliary muscles attached to suspensory ligaments. Now let's see if this video actually works. I wasn't having very good luck with any of my videos a few minutes ago, and it doesn't look like I'm going to have very good luck with this anyways. So give this wheel of death a second to run, but we'll talk about it. When the ciliary muscles contract, it causes the eye to round. When the ciliary muscles relax, it causes the lens to flatten out. So that position and shape is adjusted so light can pass through the center of the lens and project the images on the retina. Now the crazy thing is, when light passes through that actual lens itself, the light passes through it and it gets refracted, which turns the image upside down and backwards when it hits the retina. So really and truly, when that light passes through, it gets projected on there, it's backwards, generates an action potential, but your brain brings it to your conscious awareness right side up. So your brain actually interprets it backwards and flips it over so you can see regularly. Could you imagine if there was a disorder where your brain did not flip it and you saw everything upside down and backwards? Alright, let's go through some structures now of the vascular tunic. You have the pupil, which is the hole in the iris. You have the lens. You have the iris, which is the colored muscular portion of your eye, which has two sets of muscles, the radial and the sphincter muscles, which controls the size of the pupil, which adjusts the amount of light that passes through the lens. You also have the choroid, which actually has the muscles that are attached to, which is the attachment point of the iris. You have the suspensory ligaments, which attach to the ciliary muscles. The choroid and the ciliary muscles are really close to each other, so don't get those two confused. But the choroid is the attachment point for the iris. The ciliary muscles attach to suspensory ligaments, which attach to the lens, which adjusts for the change in the shape and size of the lens. Some other structures, which we'll get into in a little bit: optic disc, optic nerve, and what is called the fovea, or the macula lutea, which is where all light wants to be projected once it passes through the lens. So in this instance here, we would want the light to pass through and go wham. Not necessarily in a curve like that, but all light, you want to be projected right back there on that particular spot there. Boom. Let's stop there. That was the vascular tunic. and the fibrous tunic of the eye. The next video is going to go over to the retina or the neural tunic, which is the most complex portion. Again, without a doubt, if you have any questions, you know where to go. Google. No, I'm joking. Send me an email.